Okay, we were all watching those climate protests that were going on for about 2 weeks in London, as probably were going on in other places in the world. And I was looking there at the pink boat at Oxford Circus, people gluing themselves to trains and to the top of trains, people handcuffed to Jeremy Corbyn's fence. And I was kind of wondering to myself, is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Did that make sense? It was a little bit dramatic. And I thought to myself, well, maybe this is key. Maybe this is how we get Brexit. Isn't this what we should be doing? And I thought, gosh, was I born yesterday? If these were Brexiteers, they'd probably recommission Boris Johnson's Woofenblasters and start blowing us away with jets of water or something like that. It did seem to me that this was a little bit about theatre world. It seemed a little bit orchestrated. So, I have sympathy with the climate thing, and I don't. So on one hand, I know that there were people there, like molecular biologists and people who were talking about genetically modified food and things that I do care about and I think definitely need to be on the agenda. But in the main, there were kind of young people who were there, and when they were interviewed by Sky News, they said things like, "Oh, we're here for the vibe," or "Oh, it's such a great atmosphere." And I thought, what, is this like Glastonbury without the music and the mud? It seemed to be a little bit of a party. And I thought a lot of these people are there in numbers, but as pawns, because they don't really know anything beyond a few sound bites they've heard here and there and kind of being brainwashed. And I also looked at it and I thought it's extremely kind of upper middle class event, isn't it? If you looked around, there weren't a lot of evidence of diversity. There wasn't a lot of evidence of people from, the working class there. And I thought maybe those groups instinctively know that they are going to be at the cutting edge of this. They're going to be the first ones to pay for it. So maybe they're not really that enthusiastic about it. So I wanted to dig a little deeper and also look. Now, why this interests me is when I did the chart for Canada and Australia, and it actually also showed up in the UK chart. The big theme was children. And I think the powers that be, or the politicians or the corporations, have decided to approach politics through the vessel of children. So their new aim, get children all fired up, or young people who they can take advantage of their, kind of lack of wisdom, lack of worldly experience, lack of knowledge, because they're only at school, and their youthful idealism. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. When we're that age, we're all extremely idealistic about things and maybe don't always look at the facts. So they're going to take advantage. Hey there, Kevin. So what are they doing? They're deciding that the best way to push an agenda is get kids excited about it, because there's two things. Kids might make their parents feel guilty and therefore influence their parents, and kids are going to be the next voting bloc, and kids are so impressionable. You can get them to believe anything. As you get older, you get much more cynical. You know how to look at things, and you learn from life experience, and you're far more skeptical about human beings, about information, so you deal with things differently. But I think this is the new thing. Influence the politics via kids. And you notice the kids that are out there on this green globalism protests and all that, the first thing they say is, it's our future. They're stealing our future, all about their future, which is exactly the same argument they use for Remain. So you can see it's just transferring one argument for one thing. It's the same argument. It's all, oh, what about our future? What about our future? Kind of doesn't wash with me. It's just sort of vague, and it amounts to emotional blackmail. I also don't agree with these, a 16-year-old being invited to Downing Street, because a 16-year-old is low information. That person has nothing to offer in terms of expertise or objective knowledge. She's just there as a PR stunt, and also, again, for emotional blackmail, because you cannot debate a 16-year-old if you're an adult, because it's going to be bullying, isn't it? Because you've got so much more knowledge to bombard them with, and at the end of the day, if you go too hard at them, you could maybe make them cry. I mean, at the end of the day, they're a young person. You can't do that. So you can't debate with young people. All you can really do is sit there and say, oh, that's lovely. Yes, okay, we're very concerned. How can we have policy pushed but in this way? I think that's kind of ridiculous, but it definitely is very visible in the charts of the UK, Canada, and Australia. It's more than is something that happened. It's a conscious effort to go via young people to push agendas that they think are going to be the way forward. And then alongside that, they'll want 16-year-olds to vote and maybe 14-year-olds. And what about 10-year-olds? It's their future as well, isn't it? Come on, it's one man, one vote. Since when does one age group have priority over another age group? People who are older pay taxes longer, so there's something for them as well. So let's have a look. Now, when it comes to this whole climate thing, I agree there's a problem. I think we are definitely doing immense damage to the planet. I'm concerned about animal extinctions. I'm concerned, as George Galloway often talks about on his show recently, how when he was young, it was alive with birdsong and bees, and you'd hear all these things and see all these birds. And that kind of nature is not around nowadays. When his children see certain birds, he has to explain to his children, oh, well, that's a starling, because they've never seen them before. So there's no doubt that a lot of what we're doing is damaging the planet. And I think a key thing is planned extinction, planned redundancy, because every product you buy now, it only lasts about 2 years, no matter how well you treat it. And, I've always looked after things really well to preserve them, but it just doesn't work that way, because they're all sort of programmed to go bust in a limited amount of time. So you have to buy more, and it keeps everything going. How many of you rang up a repairman and the repairman said to you, oh, don't bother getting it repaired, it's cheaper to get a new one? How can the planet sustain that? And I do think many people make unnecessary road trips, unnecessary plane trips, especially for business. It's become a perk of business to travel. People always want to be in a job where you get to travel. And most of this travel boils down to be totally unnecessary. With the internet, you just don't need it. Before the internet, people traveled for business. You really don't need to do it now with the facility of the internet. And yet people are doing it more and more and more and more. We hear the third runway of Heathrow was just approved recently during these climate protests. So it just shows to me a total mismatch between what they really say and what they intend to do. And then I heard some of these climate protesters, the younger ones, phoning up the radio and saying that they believed, okay, that we shouldn't be importing so much, so we should be making more here. We should eat local food, have our clothes made locally rather in China, everything about local, and not travel. And I think to myself, does this conflict with the whole idea of the European Union, which is sold to us as, each country is going to be highly specialized and only produce a very narrow range of things, and we're going to import everything else from other countries? This seems to be actually harking more to nationalism, where each country is individually more self-sufficient. So that totally seems to go against the globalist agenda if we're not going to be importing so much. Why then is Brexit a problem? Surely then, if we to be a green agenda, then having a WTO exit is absolutely ideal, because we'll be importing less. So that would seem to dovetail more with what they're saying than remain, wouldn't it? And the whole tone of the people pushing this climate change and Extinction Rebellion is extremely sanctimonious and very, very authoritarian. That's what that's what worries me. And I noticed a lot of those people saying they have to protest because petitions don't work. And they said, well, 6 million people signed a petition. Well, don't people realize a petition is not a vote? A vote is the legally binding thing to elect governments or to make decisions. Petitions are not and never were legally binding. It's just a thing people do to, I don't know, get rid of their angst. Go ahead. Yeah. And so, okay. The next two things I wanted to say about this whole climate change thing, it boils down to me to two distinct avenues. One is fire over there, and another one is problem, reaction, solution. There's definitely an agenda to make people aware that there's a massive problem. Whether there is such a big problem or not, I'm not sure. So they tell us, oh, it's so extreme, we've got 12 years, it's becoming increasingly alarmist, and they make sure that there's something in the news all the time about climate, or that we're reaching some sort of climate emergency, to get people in this mode of thinking there's a problem. But when you look back, they were predicting a while ago that by the year 2000, the Maldives would be underwater. These dire predictions are nothing new, and they never seem to come to pass. And a lot of people don't look back and realize that, because their memories are short, or because they're young. They don't know. We've kind of been around this roundabout before, haven't we? So we've got to convince everyone there is a problem. Well, I think there's a problem. There's plastic in the water. It's disgusting. There's so much deforestation of there's the G5, which I think is one of the hugest problems coming our way. So there are problems. But the next thing, the only solution they want you to focus on is one based around CO2. So the problem is all CO2, which they want you to focus on rather than the other problems. And the solution is basically Agenda 21, authoritarianism, and total control of our lives. Because they want to create this problem. So there's the reaction, people getting outraged, people getting anxious, people worried, people being guilt tripped by their kids. The solution they're going to give you is more and more control, which fits in with everything we talked about in Agenda 21. Isn't it more tailored towards global government? Because we've got to have set rules for every country. Every country's got to be reducing emissions. Reducing emissions means that things are going to affect you in your life. That's why they want these smart meters. Everything called smart is all just about control. Smart meters, the Internet of Things, which is all about G5 and totally controlling the way we use our appliances and monitoring exactly what we use. So you can see that that's what's coming down the line, is a total clampdown on your freedom to live your life, the freedom to take holidays, make trips, use the appliances when and if you want to. That is what's coming down the line. And who's that going to affect? The people at the top end who can afford possibly extremely high electricity bills, they're still going to be okay and their lives will be unaffected. And if they want to make air travel extremely expensive, it cuts out most people again, except for the elite. So again, you can see that this whole structure, it's what I said again about, going back to feudalism almost, because it's going to create a two-tier society of people who go back to the days, you guys who enjoy cricket will know Geoffrey Boycott, right? And I remember him saying that he remembers he's rather old, for you guys who don't know. I'm thinking he must be over 80. He's a geezer. And he was saying he remembers the days when you were lucky if you got out of Yorkshire, which, if you don't know England, Yorkshire's kind of a big county, so it's better to be stuck in Yorkshire than it would say to be stuck in Berkshire. But, he's right. You go back to his childhood, people didn't even travel out of their county. And according to these climate change alarmists and globalists, that's probably where we're going to be going back to, where the vast majority of people don't move very far at all. So we would be moving back to a much more limited way of being and possibly limited access. When you're in the UK, it's fantastic to have all the wonderful fruits from South Africa, South America. Would they want to be stopping that now? So, there are lots of implications to this that I think, need to be thought through. The other thing I think about this climate stuff is it's all fire over there. And what I mean by that is let's focus on CO2, but let's turn a total blind eye to the problems with nuclear energy, nuclear waste, things like Fukushima, the most underreported subject of all time, because they don't want to wake people up to the problems that happen when you have a nuclear disaster. It's all very well in Chernobyl because they can say, the Soviets didn't know what that day it was, and it's all to do with the Soviets. That was their fault. A little bit harder to explain it with Japan, isn't it? Why they had such a disaster. I don't want you looking at that. And while it's totally acceptable to be as outrageous and outspoken as you want about CO2, if you go and speak about G5 and the extreme dangers of that non-ionizing shortwave electromagnetic radiation on human beings, you'll be depersoned. You'll be taken off Twitter. You'll be taken off Facebook. You'll be banned if you want to speak about that. If you protest too enthusiastically about fracking, you'll also find yourself in a cell. So you see, they want you to be worried about climate, but they only want you to be worried about CO2. You must be concerned about that. The other thing when I had a look at this whole CO2 thing is when they say climate change denial, it's oversimplifying it, because most scientists do agree that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It gets absorbed by the ocean, raises the ocean temperature, and it can raise the temperature across the world, yes, but it only raises the temperature by an absolute tiny fraction. What causes the large numbers they get is when they apply the feedback factor, which you could say is a domino effect. So as soon as it warms, CO2 warms a little bit, and that results in a chain reaction in nature, and that chain reaction contributes to a larger amount of warming. And the thing is, measuring that chain reaction and the feedback factor is extremely controversial, highly, complex mathematics. And the argument of climate change skeptics is that the climate bandwagon people have totally overestimated the feedback factor. So that's why they're getting these huge numbers for their increases in temperature. And that's what they're saying. Those are wrong. They don't understand the mathematics behind the feedback factor, which is something called a rectangular parabola. And Lord Monckton has explained it. And he actually said that when he submitted his papers on research on the feedback factor and what percentage increase it would cause, he submitted it to the scientific journals, and they sent it back saying that they have no one with a required level of maths understanding to even understand his thesis. So basically, we have a lack of mathematical understanding among climate change experts, and therefore it's very easy. Obviously, if you don't understand advanced mathematics and you aren't open-minded enough to put yourself out to understand it, you're going to believe anything, and you'll believe the models that give the most extreme numbers rather than models which might give better numbers. And of course, CO2, what about, I think the whole thing about CO2 and why it's so popular as a climate thing with globalists is because you can change people's lifestyle by controlling it. If you say to people, well, it's variations in the sun's action and the sun's kind of chemical reaction with the earth that's causing heat, that's far more alarmist because everyone knows we can't control that. So they want to make the public think it's in our control and that we can change, we can do something. But what if it's all just down to the sun and things we can't change? Then we wouldn't be able to do anything anyway. So that's kind of my argument about some of these things. I also, I'm totally against GM food. And what about, I think the biggest misnomer is that electric cars are the solution. Electric cars, which you charge in your home using electricity from a coal-fired fire station. How is that good? What about even the smallest Nissan Leaf has a 500-pound battery? Batteries, we know, everyone knows if they've disposed of a car battery, you're not allowed to put it in the dump. There are very special ways you have to dispose of it because it's so incredibly toxic. Have they thought about how they're going to dispose of all these batteries, which only last 5 years? Imagine every car you see on the road in the UK or in the US, wherever you are, with one of these batteries. What are they going to do with all these batteries? They only last 5 years or possibly less, depending on how much you drive. Where's the thinking? Nothing is thought through, is it? Also with wind turbines, 5% of the time the wind is, I think it's only 90% of the time, 90% of the time, the wind is either blowing too fast for it to work or not enough for it to work. And for that period, you have to have a coal-fired power station on standby, ready to pick up the slack. And it actually is more environmentally damaging to keep these big coal-fired power stations on standby. Ridiculous. As I talked about in my Agenda 21 blog as well, that the whole Paris Accord is a total misnomer because it only puts the onus on the West, whereas India are allowed to build their filthy power stations until 2050, China until 2030. So they're not slowing down. So while in the West and in England, where we only contribute 1% to the world's CO2, we're having these stringent rules put on us, which is damaging the economy, damaging jobs, damaging prospects. But in other countries, they're not having to face any regulations whatsoever. So we literally throwing teaspoons off the Titanic, while China and those others with extremely heavy industries like concrete, Saudi Arabia and America with all their air conditioning, blasting out, they're really contributing far more than we are. And the Paris Accord doesn't address that. So the whole Paris Accord is just about redistribution of wealth and a takedown of the West rather than anything else. And Donald Trump's right on that basis to pull out of it. It's not an America First policy, is it? So we talked about and I noticed there's not enough alarm about the animal extinctions and the poaching of animals. Definitely, as far as I'm concerned, with nature, not enough alarm, and certainly not enough alarm of what all this never mind G5. I mean, what about the rest of it? The Wi-Fi. It's obviously damaging the environment. I never hear much about that at all. Just to end off by saying, it's always I've found that it's a very interesting tool recently to find who is funding things and who's funding Extinction Rebellion. Well, recently on Twitter, Extinction Rebellion, who's driving all this climate change, started promoting on their website something called XR Business. And it seems this thing, XR Business, is now an intrinsic part of the whole Extinction Rebellion project. It's essentially what it is, And what EAXR is business leaders who are basically wanting to capitalize on a get-rich-quick scheme, all right, via this climate change. Now, here's the conundrum. A lot of these climate change people are essentially communist, not all communists, but they are leaning towards socialism and communism, especially the more ardent ones. And yet, Extinction Rebellion is primarily a tool of capitalism. Now, look, I've got no problem with capitalism. You all know that. But I think it's worth, looking at the conflict of interests here. So, for example, there's a organization, WHEB, and they have a initiative called Thought Leadership. And they want to be at the leading edge of sustainable and responsible investment. They want to bring together impact investments and intermediaries who have the capacity to invest and intervene at scale, making multi-million-dollar investments and aggregating funds large enough to access institutional capital. That sounds to me like a green investment bank. And investment banks are ways for people to get exceedingly rich. There's another XR business leader who's the co-founder of Tribe Impact Capital LLP, who says it's the globalization is a new wealth order. Yeah, that's nice. New wealth order. I think we know what that means. And they want to embrace industry disruption as an opportunity. Yes, well, that's what business does, doesn't it? Steps in to crisis to create opportunities. And this tribal impact shows little interest in challenging capitalism or in calling for degrowth. In fact, its goals are long-term growth, positive impact, and growth for everybody. The XR business leaders, many of them come from industries like Aviva Investors, Body Shop International, Unilever. All right, Paul Polman, who was until recently the CEO of Unilever, is also on this whole XR. He's a key proponent of it. So you can see the link here. I've always got it. I've got it in the back there, the Vulcanist agenda, the link between capitalism, the huge industrialists, the biggest money, not small business or medium-sized business, the link between the biggest money and so-called what a lot of people think is communist. So if you look at climate change as the new Bolshevism, then you have the capitalists all right behind it, just like they were behind Bolshevism, right? And another XR business groupie, Jake Heyman, was saying that, listen to this one. He said there's something called the 10 years time program. It is tailored for the next generation of high net worth families who are looking to invest capital into ambitious new ideas rather than following the crowd to the safe ground. So again, hear that it's all about high net worth families, hashtag the elites, we call them on this channel. Another company is looking to capitalize on the global shift to greater sustainability. And they're also looking, another one of these XR kind of group, movers and shakers, should we call it, is looking to manage the UK government's £400 million investment fund aimed at increasing the uptake of electric vehicles. And so no vested interests there then. And there was another founding CEO of Nix Energy Capital, who is the leading international solar investment and asset management. So basically, a lot of companies who are looking to sell, to gain from the United Kingdom government's budget for either solar energy or to promote electric cars, and they produce these things. So we see a total biggest business jumping on the bandwagon, pushing forward, funding Extinction Rebellion, because they know Extinction Rebellion are basically steering people right into the arms of their business. So it's not just about being concerned about the environment. It's that the things they are pushing are not necessarily solutions that are going to save the planet, but they are things that are going to make a lot of people a lot of money. So it's a no-brainer, really. By the way, that comes from an article that I found online when I was just reading you, and I'll put a link to it in the box so that I acknowledge that person and that you can take a read of the whole article yourself. It was full of names and company names, but basically that's the gist of it. So that's my whole feeling. I had to weigh in on the whole climate thing because obviously a lot of people have been talking about it, but I don't think those exact points were emphasized. So let's just keep our eyes open. I do think we should all do a lot for the climate, but we should be asking the right questions, not just getting swept along, looking, as I say, fire over there, looking where they want us to look. It's probably the totally wrong direction. Anyway, guys, take care. Look after yourselves. Have a great bank holiday Monday if you are off.